I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, appointing bishops. China responds to Vatican objections. Same-sex marriage. Faith leaders raise concerns over a Senate bill. We have a report and reaction. Holiday shopping. Analysis of how the economy and a potential rail strike could impact gift giving. And needlepoint nativity. A micro artist selects a unique canvas to portray our Savior's birth. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, China is again offering to collaborate with the Vatican on the issue of bishop nominations. This word comes after the Holy See objected last weekend to Beijing's installation of an auxiliary in a diocese not recognized by the Vatican. It was the first time the Holy See explicitly accused Beijing of violating a recently renewed agreement regarding the appointment of bishops. There are between 6 and 12 million Catholics in China, split between the underground church loyal to the Pope and the state-sanctioned one. Meantime, Pope Francis is expressing his sorrow over the death of a newly elevated cardinal, Richard Bawov. In a statement today, the Holy Father said in part, quote, "Grant to this wise and gentle pastor the reward of his labors and welcome him into the light and peace of heaven." Pope Francis also extended his condolences to the late cardinal's family. Cardinal Bawov died Sunday night in Rome. He had recently been released from the hospital where he had spent several months with heart trouble. Cardinal Bawov was 63 years old. Back here in the United States, the Senate is voting on legislation that seeks to protect same-sex marriages. Many legal experts say it could also threaten the future of religious liberty. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has more on this bill and what it does. Eric.
Well, good evening, Trace. You know, Democrats and a handful of Republicans have been pushing for this bill titled the Respect for Marriage Act for months. Now, what it does is it repeals the traditional definition of marriage between one man and one woman. Republican Senator Mike Lee says conscious rights are at stake because it puts actually churches and other religious affiliated groups on notice.
The bill will put in jeopardy the work and existence of religiously minded social agencies, educational institutions, and other nonprofits, as their tax-exempt status will be threatened.
The Heritage Foundation agrees, calling the Marriage Equality Act an attack on people's basic religious liberty.
Liberals are hurrying to cram through their far-left agenda.
During the Thanksgiving football games, the organization spent more than $1 million in commercial ads in states where 12 Republicans voted for the act.
The Respect for Marriage Act would essentially train the Department of Justice on individual religious believers and on religiously affiliated organizations and nonprofits that are not explicitly churches.
Dr. Jay Richards says this act could open the door to lawsuits against religious organizations such as Catholic adoption agencies.
In the case of an adoption agency, that they ought to place children up for adoption in families with a married mother and a father. That, under this law, unfortunately, could lead to at least legal violations of people's supposed civil rights, in which you get sued by the Department of Justice, and you could also get sued in civil court by individuals who might claim to be harmed by this.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops also weighed in. It wrote to lawmakers saying the bill's a threat to American culture. Quote, "The Respect for Marriage Act's rejection of timeless truths about marriage is evident on its face and in its purpose. It would also betray our country's commitment to the fundamental right of religious liberty." It's important to note that this amended bill will have to go back to the House in order to get another vote. That's expected later this week, and President Joe Biden says as soon as it reaches his desk, he's expected to sign it. Meanwhile, House Republican leaders have pledged to introduce pro-life and family bills when they take the majority in the House come January. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Top congressional leaders traveled to the White House today to meet with President Joe Biden. They talked about what needs to be done between now and Christmas. And while they were there, we asked them about the so-called Respect for Marriage Act. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, outside the White House, I was able to ask congressional leaders about the Marriage Act that Eric just reported on. The Democratic leaders started to respond as they walked away.
Respect for Marriage Act, man? No, we hope to get it done.
Yeah, but Catholic bishops say it's a poorly named bill that further undermines the truth of marriage. Your response, Speaker? Sir, the Respect for Marriage Act. Catholic bishops say religious protections in the Respect for Marriage Act are insufficient and far from comprehensive and treat religious liberty as a second-class right. As you know, it's currently in the Senate. Do you agree with that assessment by the Catholic bishops?
I agree with them, yes.
The congressional leader spoke outside the White House after an important meeting inside with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris.
And there's a lot to do, including resolving the train strike.
The president says Congress has to act to prevent a looming strike, warning the economy is at risk. But the question remains...
Mr. President, are you confident you can avoid a rail strike?
Later, the president left for Bay City, Michigan to visit a computer chip factory planning a $300 million expansion. One of his goals, promote manufacturing jobs. The president also sent the U.S. Secretary of State overseas to Romania. Antony Blinken emphasized NATO's resolve while condemning Russia's actions in the Black Sea.
Russia has turned parts of the Black Sea into a war zone. We've seen missiles from warships coming into Ukrainian cities and towns.
Meanwhile, if you walk around the White House campus right now, you'll see plenty of French flags. That's because President Biden will soon host French President Emmanuel Macron for a state visit. Macron arrives tonight in Washington. Over the next few days, there'll be plenty of meetings, a news conference, and of course, a fancy state dinner. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And with us tonight is Rabbi Yaakov Menken, Managing Director for the Coalition for Jewish Values. Rabbi, great to see you as always. As we mentioned today, the U.S. Senate votes on a bill to protect same-sex marriage. The Mormons and other denominations gave that proposal a thumbs up. Curious, what is the Jewish community's take on this?
Well, there is a bit of a split because Coalition for Jewish Values agrees with the Catholic bishops that these protections are insufficient. Whereas the Orthodox Union has agreed with the Latter-day Saints that with the amendment, it's good enough. We're very worried, actually, about the consequences, just as all of you are. And there's a little bit of an additional worry because in a lot of cases, we've seen bills like this and laws like this turn into legal efforts to persecute the Jewish community, whether that be on the ability to do ritual slaughter or circumcision or even to have synagogues within walking distance of our homes. So the Jewish community actually should be, I would have expected us to be united and very alarmed.
Yeah, and there's something else I'm going to talk about. There's also some drama over in the House, where Representative Ilhan Omar is kind of crying foul, saying that the likely next Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, will remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's a long time coming. It's very unfortunate that, this is how you allow anti-Semitism to fester. They pretend that they're going to be concerned about anti-Semitism, and then they only do it in a partisan way. Right now, there's a huge uproar about Donald Trump hosting Kanye West and someone who he didn't know, who turned out to be Nick Fuentes. And obviously that was a mistake. Obviously he shouldn't do it. But compare that to the congressmen who are willing to work alongside Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib elevating actual anti-Semitism throughout the House. Instead of, when they said that we're going to deal with anti-Semitism, they removed Marjorie Taylor Greene from her committee assignments for something she never said. Meanwhile, they never went after Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that meeting with President Trump and Kanye West and the other gentleman. I want to, out of curiosity, ask you, what has been the reaction with other Orthodox rabbis about that meeting?
There's pretty united opinion, obviously, that this was a very bad mistake on the president's part and exactly what was going on. I personally give him something of a charitable take in that he has been such a friend to our community and so consistently so that it's obvious he has a long-standing friendship with Kanye West. He thought it was going to be a private meeting. He didn't know this was going to be a big deal. But what he actually should have done is condemned his anti-Semitic remarks. And then at the meeting, he should have again condemned the anti-Semitic remarks. And then there would be no uproar. Then there would be, I'm going to give you counseling and I'm going to help you out. And I know that you've destroyed your career over this, but you got to understand this anti-Semitism is wrong. And now that it's become such a major conflict, we're kind of disappointed that he hasn't said anything yet.
Yeah, and of course, we don't really know what happened in that meeting, so maybe more things will come out. Rabbi, before I let you go, last weekend, Pope Francis met with a number of Jewish leaders taking action to strengthen Jewish-Catholic ties. What more can you tell us about this meeting in Rome?
I actually was not privy to any of that. I don't really know about the increase. I know that, look, ever since Vatican II, there's been a gradual increase in relationships between the Catholics and the Jews. And, you know, it's been our honor to work alongside the USCCB and so many other organizations on things like Respect for Marriage Act and the things where we find common ground to work together to make policies that are better for all Americans.
And Rabbi, we probably have about 30 seconds left or so, but curious, you know, what else are you following? What's on your radar?
Well, obviously, you know, the biggest issue for us is watching what's going to happen when this new Congress comes in, both with regards to anti-Semitism as well as regards to all these pro-values issues that we share. We obviously want the agenda to get a nice reset and be able to move in a much more positive direction.
We're going to leave it right there. Rabbi Menken, always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including surprising new census figures from the UK and what they say about the number of Christians. And was Black Friday a boon or a bust for retailers? We find out. Thanks for staying with us. The numbers are in high prices and inflation woes did not seem to dampen the spirits of early holiday shoppers. Black Friday sales soared to the tune of more than $9 billion in online shopping alone. That is an increase of a little more than 2% over the past year. That is according to Adobe Analytics. Cyber Monday, staying in stride, was still the biggest online shopping day of the year. And with us tonight in our studio is EJ Antony, Research Fellow for Regional Economics at the Heritage Foundation. EJ, welcome. Thank you so much for being on.
Tracy, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So break this down for us. I know a lot of people were kind of struggling to put some food on the table over Thanksgiving, but yet we saw those really strong retail numbers for Black Friday.
Sure. We had our most expensive Thanksgiving ever. And a lot of people are wondering, where are consumers getting all of this money? Because we're spending more this Black Friday, this Cyber Monday, for example, than we did last year. But I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to is just because we're spending more money doesn't mean consumers are actually able to buy more actual stuff. And so we're seeing prices rise even faster than the total spending on goods and services. In other words, consumers are spending more, but actually getting less.
And what did these consumers buy this Black Friday? Were there high-ticket items or lower-priced items?
You know, it's been a real mix, and there haven't been any significant standouts when we compare it, for example, to last year's data.
Another thing I want to touch on, too, is the topic of retail theft. I mean, that's really a big topic there. I know last week Target reported a 50% profit loss, and they say that has to do in part to shoplifting, which is a problem there. And I know it's not just hitting the bigger retailers. Also, it's a big problem for small businesses.
Absolutely, especially when you consider the fact that these small businesses have much thinner margins on each item, so that at the end of the day, when you have one item stolen from a small business, that represents a much more significant loss than when you compare it to one of these large corporations. But I think that issue in particular points to the larger systemic problem of a cultural rot in our society that tolerates that kind of behavior, this retail theft.
Yeah. Another thing that's on a lot of people's radar right now is the potential for the railroad, the deadline coming up for that, and wondering if Congress is going to intervene in case that strike does happen. Let's talk about the potential impacts of a railroad strike. What would that do to our economy, especially now during the holiday season?
Sure. I think the best way to frame this is that if you think about during the pandemic, all of the shortages and things that we had because of the government-imposed lockdowns, remember that railroad workers were considered essential. So now imagine essentially the lockdowns, but significantly worse in terms of that economic impact, because we really underestimate how much everything travels by rail.
I was going to say that. I mean, a lot of people don't realize things even such as crude oil is brought on by rail cars. What about that? I mean, we're already facing record high energy numbers. What would potentially happen if this strike does go through? What would happen to energy costs for people?
Imagine the high prices we saw over the summer going even higher, because at least during the summer, we did not have those kinds of supply shocks. So it would be even worse than what we've seen. Now, it looks like Congress is probably going to avert that and force this deal on the unions, but we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to pick up on the oil. We have been talking about Venezuela and them being able to drill down there in Venezuela. I said, coming here to the United States and allowing the drilling to happen here. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Your thoughts on that?
It's amazing that the same administration which refuses to allow domestic producers, who produce much more cleanly, by the way, than they do overseas in most countries, we refuse to allow our domestic producers here at home to actually get the oil out of the ground, refine it, and bring those finished products to market. But instead, we're going to be in hock to dictators overseas who don't even like us very much, and those same dictators are people for whom we don't really care for either, and we fundamentally disagree with the way those countries are run and the things that those people stand for.
Yeah, it's really a head scratcher there. Why would we even do that? Before we let you go, we have about a minute left. I want to talk about China. Of course, our thoughts and prayers are with all the protesters there and what they are facing right now. But also, so much of our manufacturing comes from China. How do you see this playing out, and what could be the potential impact on the global markets and here in the United States if this continues?
Well, speaking of dictators overseas with whom we fundamentally disagree, right? We have become so incredibly intertwined with the Chinese supply chain that just like the COVID lockdowns over there have been incredibly disruptive, so too these protests stand to be incredibly disruptive as well. And that's going to do no favors to our supply chain and no favors to bringing more supply of goods and services to the market. And one of the reasons why that's so important in fighting inflation is that the more you can increase supply, the more you bring down costs to the American consumer. And so these protests in China are going to do exactly the opposite to that.
Yeah, EJ, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Tracy, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And up next on EWTN News Nightly, we hear from the United Kingdom's ambassador to the Holy See as he calls attention to the rise of sexual violence amid global conflicts. Plus, how one artist pinpoints his skill to create a one-of-a-kind nativity scene. Hong Kong's High Court says a prominent lawyer from the UK is allowed to defend Catholic businessman Jimmy Lai. The trial is set to start Thursday. Lai faces charges stemming from a Beijing-imposed national security law. Meantime, Hong Kong's leader does not want the UK lawyer to participate. He is asking China to intervene. While Taiwan is calling on China to adjust its strict COVID-19 lockdown policy.
积极地聆听人民的声音，以及回应人民合理的要求。美国让中国大陆的社会。
Taipei says Beijing should safeguard basic rights and freedom of mobility for its people. A former student leader from the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests also spoke during a press conference today. He says recent demonstrations against enforced lockdowns could mark a new era of political resistance in China. For the first time in the United Kingdom census, Christians are a minority of the population. Figures released today show less than half in England and Wales follow the country's official religion, and more than a third of the population claims no religion. Secularists say the study shows it is time to rethink the role religion plays in British society. Also in the United Kingdom, officials are highlighting the rise of sexual violence in areas of conflict. The UK is hosting an international conference on combating the problem. Last Saturday, its embassy to the Holy See held a march in Rome. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Tannhauser has more.
Joining me here in front of St. Peter's is UK Ambassador to the Holy See, Chris Trott. Thank you so much for being with us.
Welcome.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the march that you organized and why you organized this march?
So we decided we wanted to find a way of drawing attention to the issue of sexual violence in conflict. Of course, sexual violence is a scourge wherever it happens. But we're particularly conscious of the fact that rape is used as a weapon of war in many conflicts around the globe. And so we wanted to march from the island in the Tiber River to St. Peter's Square on Sunday, just to draw attention to the suffering of the victims in advance of a conference that's being organized in London yesterday and today on this subject.
Ambassador, before you came to Rome, I understand you were placed in South Sudan.
Yes.
And you must have experienced at least the effects of sexual violence in war
yes.
personally being there.
I mean, for me personally, I have, in a number of different places around the world over the course of my career, I've come across examples of sexual violence being used in conflict against women and against children. And in South Sudan, it was used by the different sides during the civil conflict there up until 2018 when the peace agreement was signed. It's being used today in Ukraine. And so it's time for the world to come together and say this is just completely unacceptable. This has to stop.
What was the reaction like of the Holy Father also when you presented that?
We were very moved because while the Holy Father talks a lot about sexual violence, he has never done it in the context of a conflict. And he specifically mentioned, he recognized that we had done our walk, and he specifically mentioned that it cannot be used as a weapon of war in his greeting to the crowd after the Angelus. And we were very pleased about that, because I think it's important that we have his moral authority in the context of this discussion.
So Pope Francis was very encouraging also on this topic.
Yes, he was.
You've been here for 1.5 years now in Rome. Your experience with being an ambassador to the Holy See?
I'm finding it really rewarding engaging with the Holy See. I think, as I mentioned when I first came to talk to you or your colleagues a year ago just after I arrived, coming with a background of working in Africa, I felt that now was a good time to be engaging with the Vatican because of the interest that Pope Francis himself has, but also then his team have collectively in issues that challenge lives in the global south. And for me, being able to come here and engage, I found a really receptive response to my experience. And I found it richly rewarding in helping me understand how the Catholic Church, in all its different formats, not just the Vatican, but religious orders and others, are engaging in the continent, supporting those that are far less fortunate than us, in supporting education, in supporting health. And this is something that, for me, is really rewarding and interesting.
The UK Ambassador to the Holy See, Trott, thank you so much for taking your time and being with us. In Rome, Andreas Tonhauser, EWTN News Nightly.
A 76-year-old British engraver has created the world's smallest nativity scene. Graham Short etched a depiction of Jesus' birth onto a speck of gold mounted in the eye of a needle. It took him 40 hours to complete. His work is on display at a church in Northfield, England, where visitors can view the piece under a microscope. Its value is estimated at nearly $24,000 US. Finally, tonight, thousands of Peruvians flood the streets to celebrate a historical holiday dedicated to Christ. Blending Catholic and Native culture, the Snow Star Festival is held every year before the Feast of Corpus Christi. Dancers dress themselves in animal skin and tree bark to honor their heritage. The Christian aspects of the ritual date from the 1700s. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.